Assalamu alaikum, welcome to lesson number 11, Mu'tada, and this is group 6. So let's look at a few rules here. First of all, if a woman starts bleeding before her habit, okay, so a woman starts to bleed before the days of her habit have started, then there's three situations here. Okay, scenario number one, or situation number one, the number of days from when the blood starts or started to the last day of her habit is 10 days or less. So it's less than 10 days. In that case, what will happen is that she will consider that to be haidh. That will be considered as haidh, and so she stops praying as soon as the blood starts, and other rulings will apply. Right, scenario number two, the number of days from when she started bleeding. Right, so the number of days when blood started to the last day of the habit is more than 10 days. Right, so it's more than 10 days, but the number of days between the blood and the beginning of the habit is less than 15 days. Okay, so I'll explain this with scenarios. And so in this case, what will happen is she does not consider it to be haidh, and initially, that is, remember that initially, and she continues to pray and fast and do her other acts of ibadah. Okay, scenario number 3 is if that bleeding, or if the number of days is more than 15. So between when her blood started, first day we're seen, and the habit, start of the habit, there's 15 days or more in between. In that case, she considers it to be haidh. The first blood she sees is haidh, and so she stops praying, fasting, etc. Right, so let me explain these in scenarios. Now the first scenario we've actually done in the previous lessons, so we're not going to deal with that. What we are going to deal with here is the second and third. So let's say 5 days of bleeding and she has 15 days of purity. Okay, so that's fine. So as soon as the bleeding starts, what do we consider this to be? Haidh or istihadha? So because the bleeding started before the habit, and if you were to count the number of days from the beginning, right, all the way up to the end of the habit, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days of bleeding, so you count those 5 there, and then you have 5, and then you have 5 again, which is more than 10. Okay, more than 10 there. However, in between, from day 1 of bleeding to the beginning of the habit, the days are less than 15. So because that's the case, what we say is that here she continues to pray, and she considers it to be haidh initially, but once the blood stopped after 5 days, she knew it was haidh, so she takes a bath, and she considers all of that to be haidh. Okay, so once the blood stops after 5 days, she realizes now that it's haidh, right? And all those days of praying, they were wrong, but she won't be considered sinful. Remember that. There will be no sin for praying and fasting on those days. So the blood is considered 5 days, and the purity is considered to be 15 days. Okay, so let's color that in. Right. Next, scenario number 2 is if the bleeding after 15 days, the bleeding lasts for 3 days only. So in this case, if the bleeding lasts only for 3 days, again it fulfills the criteria of bleeding, right? However, because it occurred before the habit by more than 10 days, from day 1 to end of the habit, but less than 15 days, what we say is as soon as she saw day 1 bleeding, she does not stop, she continues to pray and fast, etc. But once the 3rd day, after the 3rd day she stopped bleeding, she realized she has to take a bath, because all 3 days are now considered to be haidh. Okay, so once bleeding stopped after 3 days, she considers it to be haidh. Right? No sin for praying and fasting, etc. Okay, so that's the bleeding is equal to 3 days, and the purity is equal to 15 days. Okay, the next scenario number 3 is if the bleeding continued for 8 days. So again, 15 days of purity. After the 15 days, she started to bleed, and the bleeding lasted for 8 days. So now, because the bleeding started before the habit, we count the number of days. So from the beginning all the way to the end of the habit, it's more than 10 days, and from beginning to the beginning of the habit is less than 15. So we say she, on day 1 when she saw the blood, she continues to pray, fast, etc. However, once day 8 finished, she takes a bath, because now she realizes all 8 days were haidh and she made a mistake, which is totally fine. So the blood is now 8 days and the purity is 15 days. Okay, right, let's move on to number 4 then. So this time what happens is she bleeds for 2 days. So 2 days of bleeding after 15 days, and we know 2 days doesn't qualify. But anyway, does she have to stop praying? So because it's more than 10 days and less than 15 in between, she doesn't stop praying, she continues to pray. However, as soon as the 2 days expired, she doesn't need to take a wudu, she takes wudu, and those 2 days are considered to be istihada, right? Because they're less than 3 days. And so blood is not applicable here, and the purity continues more than 15 days until the next time she bleeds. And so that's scenario number 4. Okay, now scenario number 5 here, right, let's say here the bleeding after the purity of 15 days, the bleeding exceeded 10 days. So here's an example of the bleeding exceeding 10 days and going to 13 days. 13 days of bleeding. Now 13 days of bleeding means that 2 days will occur within the habit. And so if we count or measure the number of days from day 1 to the end of the habit, we'll find that it's more than 10 days, and the gap between the first day and day 1 of the habit is less than 15 days. Okay, so here we say on day 1 she continues to pray, fast, etc. Okay, now once she reached the habit, she stops praying because now she knows that it might be haidh. So, or some other days will definitely be haidh. So she takes a bath after day 12. If she hasn't taken a bath before that, from day 5, right? Because after day 12 when she stopped, she knows that it's not going to go anymore. So now she did have haidh, but those haidh days were from day 1 to day 5. Now here you're probably thinking, well, why doesn't she take a bath after day 10? And it's all to do with the habit, the bleeding going into the habit, because now we know if the bleeding goes into the habit more than 3 days, then those 3 days or more will be considered haidh, and the rest of it will be considered as istihada. I'll show you an example after this for the scenario. So from day 6 to day 12 is all istihada, and 1 to 5 is haidh. So we say the blood is 5 days and the purity is 15 days. Okay, that's that. Now let me show you an example of what I meant about bleeding occurring within the habit. So let's say after the 15 days of purity, 13 days of bleeding occur. So the last one was 12 days. This is 13 days of bleeding. So now 3 days come within the habit. Okay, so first of all, we measure from day 1 to the end of the habit. Is it more than 10? So we find that yes, this is more than 10. And we measure from day 1 to the beginning of the habit, and we find that is this more than 15? No, it's less than 15. So that means she continues to pray when the blood starts on day 1, and when it reaches day 10, in other words when it reaches the habit, she stops praying because now it's most likely to be haidh. So she stops praying there, and because the blood stopped after 3 days, she takes a bath. So now she definitely knows that haidh has occurred, and these 3 days, 11, 12 and 13, will be considered as haidh days, and the rest of the days before that will be considered to be istihada. And that's simply because 3 days occurred within the habit, and this is an important rule to understand. So it renders all of that istihada and 3 days as haidh. Right, so the blood is equal to 3 days and the purity equals 25 days, right, because that's the purity continuing. Okay, so this is the rule I wanted to explain. Now let me just show you an example of what happens when there's a gap of 15 days. So let's say a woman bleeds for 5 days, and now normally she has 50 days of purity. And this is possible, so she has her normal purity is 50 days habit, and after 50 days she has 5 days, etc. like that. But on this occasion what's happened is that she began to bleed after 40 days. So let's mark over here roughly 40 days. Okay, it's not accurate, but let's imagine this is 40 days there, and then after that she has 5 days of bleeding. So her habit occurs over here, right over here, after 50 days. So what's happened is 40 days of bleeding, so 40 days of purity, after that 5 days of bleeding has occurred. So when we measure this, we find that it occurs, or it's more than 10 days from day 1 to the end of the habit, but the gap in between is less than 15 days. So here she continues to pray and fast, etc. Right, according to the rule. Also she takes a bath after the 5 days because now she knows that this was haidh. And and she won't be sinful for the days of praying. Right, now let's say what happens is 5 days of bleeding, and then after the 5 days of bleeding, she has 20 days of purity, and then she has 5 days of bleeding again. Now here's the habit, and you can see the distance between the habit and the bleeding is more than 10 days, but the gap between the first day and the first day of the habit is more than 15. So because this is more than 15, even though her bleeding occurred 10 days before more than 10 days, she must stop praying, fasting, etc. because of that more than 15. Right, and she bathes here, takes a bath after the 5th day, and now she considers herself to be clean. Her habit has changed to 20 days and 5 days. So that's a rule which is very important to understand. Hope that makes sense. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.